2 months. That was how long Novigrad lived under the rule of something that was not human, and no one noticed. The head of the Secret Service, the man who ordered torture as casually as ordering breakfast, who disappeared citizens in the night, who built his power on systematic cruelty, had been dead for 2 months. A heart attack in his chambers, silent, unwitnessed, except by the thing that took his place. For 2 months, the arrests decreased. The torture chambers saw less use. The bodies floating in the Pontar carried fewer signs of interrogation. Non-humans found themselves facing questions instead of immediate execution. The machinery of oppression that had ground through the city for decades began, almost imperceptibly, to slow. No one suspected. The Doppler wearing Chappelle's face performed cruelty when necessary to maintain the disguise, made the displays of force that authority required, spoke with the same harsh voice, moved with the same intimidating presence, signed the same documents with the same signature. But beneath the performance, something fundamental had shifted. When Caleb Menge finally discovered the truth, a moment's hesitation at a silver chalice, and burned the Doppler in Hierarch Square, before a cheering crowd, the cities celebrated the purification of evil from their midst. They never recognized that the evil had been dead for 2 months, and the thing they burned was the closest to mercy Novigrad's governance had ever known. There was a form the world did not recognize. Not monster, not quite. The word carried weight it could not hold, edges that refused to fit the shape beneath. In natural state, a Doppler resembled something unfinished. Bald, yellow-eyed, long-nosed, and longer-limbed, with tongue and fingers stretched as if the maker had pulled too hard and left the clay sagging. A figure molded from dough and abandoned before the work was complete. They rarely remained that way. The plateau near the Pontar Delta knew them first, before humans arrived with their cities and their certainties. Dopplers lived among wolf packs in winter, among deer herds in spring. They wore fur and fang, not as costume, but as completion. A wolf among wolves, indistinguishable save for the knowledge they carried beneath the transformation. When snow came, they hibernated in wind throws, curled in forms borrowed from whatever creatures survived the cold best. This was survival, but not the kind humans would later impose. In those years, before the first landing, before humans crossed the seas and claimed the continent as if it had been waiting for them, Dopplers existed in a state that might be called peace. If one were generous with the word, they possessed no claws of their own, no venom, no particular strength beyond what they borrowed from the shapes they wore. The ability to change served as compensation for what nature had not provided, a defense without aggression, a way to disappear into the world rather than stand against it. The forest did not judge them for this. Neither did the wolves, who accepted a packmate that smelled correct, moved correct, responded to hierarchy as any wolf would. The transformation was not illusion, not some trick of light or manipulation of perception that a spell could shatter. It was cellular, complete. When a Doppler became a wolf, the body remade itself down to the last fiber, blood flowed differently, bones restructured, even the emanation, the subtle signature that Witcher medallions detected, that mages could sense, shifted to match the copied form perfectly. This made them invisible in ways no magic could achieve. It also made them vulnerable in ways no magic could protect against. Silver disrupted the process. Even contact with a small amount of the metal could force a Doppler back toward their natural form, the transformation unraveling like thread pulled from fabric. Any item a Doppler created from their own body, a sword, a piece of clothing, equipment that appeared alongside the borrowed shape, would revert to torn flesh if separated from the rest of the Doppler's mass. This limitation was not weakness so much as the terms of their existence, the price of perfect mimicry. But the transformation copied more than flesh. When a Doppler took a new form, they acquired the voice, the gait, the unconscious gestures and characteristic behaviors, the skills, a swordsman's training, a merchant's cunning, even a witcher's signs. All of this came instinctively, without prior observation, without study. The Doppler simply became, and in becoming, understood. For a moment, brief, fleeting, they also knew the thoughts. Not memories, precisely. The mechanism remained uncertain. Whether Dopplers truly absorbed memories during transformation or accessed something else, an intuitive understanding drawn from the person's immediate thoughts and patterns, was a question even experienced witchers could not answer definitively. What Dudu himself would later describe to Geralt suggested the latter. "I knew your thoughts for a moment," he said, "including the ones you don't want to admit to, the ones you hide from yourself. A moment, not a lifetime, not the accumulated history of the person, but the active surface of their mind during the transformation itself. Dopplers, it seemed, copied only what they could comprehend, and what they comprehended was limited by their own nature, or so one witcher would conclude after careful observation. You're a poor little good-natured doppler," a witcher would one day say to one of them, cornered in a market tent with nowhere left to run. "You only know how to copy what is good in us because you don't understand the bad in us." The witcher was not wrong. Centuries before that confrontation, before Novigrad rose from trading post to metropolis, Dopplers lived without needing to understand human evil. They knew predation, the wolf's hunger, the hawk's dive, but this was clean. Survival without malice. The forest operated on terms that made sense to them. Take what was needed, avoid what could kill, adapt to the season. Humans brought different terms entirely. The first landing changed the continent in ways that would take generations to fully comprehend. Humans arrived with their ships and their certainties, their religions and their conviction that the world existed to be shaped according to their vision. They built settlements on the plateau where Dopplers had once lived. They named the river Delta as if naming made it theirs. They brought with them the idea that anything not human was suspect, and anything that could impersonate humans was an abomination. The hunts began early. Accounts differ on whether the persecution started from fear or from opportunity. Some survivors, accounts preserved through oral tradition among the few Dopplers who remained, described settlers who genuinely believed they were protecting their communities. Others spoke of bounties, of sport, of humans who hunted Dopplers like rabid dogs, simply because they could. The description recurred in multiple sources, rabid dogs, as if the Dopplers' capacity to mimic somehow infected them with disease, as if transformation itself was contagion that had to be purged before it spread. Most Dopplers did not survive the first decades of human settlement. Those who did faced a choice that was not really a choice at all: flee to the wilderness and face continued hunting in isolation, or move to the growing human cities and hide in plain sight. The latter option carried its own perils, but it offered something the wilderness could not: crowds, complexity, enough human faces that one more would not draw attention. Novigrad became the destination for many. The city, founded on principles of trade and ostensible tolerance, promised that all races could coexist under rule of law. Dwarves established banks. Halflings operated merchant networks. Elves, those who survived the wars and chose assimilation over rebellion, found places in the markets and guilds. Even gnomes, rarely seen and often forgotten, moved through the city's underground passages. Dopplers, theoretically, should have fit into this mosaic. They did not. The mistrust that humans carried for Dopplers did not diminish with urbanization. If anything, it intensified. A dwarf was a dwarf, recognizable, predictable in form, if not always in action. A Doppler could be anyone, could be the person standing next to you in the market, could be your business partner, your neighbor, your spouse. The very thing that allowed Dopplers to survive, their perfect mimicry, became the evidence used to justify their persecution. Fear makes its own logic, and logic, once established, resists contradiction. The Church of the Eternal Fire, rising to prominence in Novigrad during the same period, codified this fear into doctrine. They called Dopplers vexlings, a term that carried connotations of annoyance and threat simultaneously. To even speak of seeing a vexling within city walls became heresy, because the city was protected by the Eternal Fire itself, and to suggest that such a creature could pass those protections was to doubt the fire's power. One innkeeper, accused of consorting with a Doppler, was locked in the dungeons and tortured for his blasphemy. His crime? Truthfully reporting what he had witnessed. When captured, Dopplers faced execution methods designed as much for spectacle as for certainty. Fanatical priests, not all priests, but enough, would encase the Doppler in clay vessels mixed with metal shavings. The vessel would be sealed and placed in fire. The heat would rise. The Doppler, unable to escape, unable to transform their way free, would expand as the temperature increased. Eventually, the vessel would burst. The crowds that gathered for these executions were told they were witnessing the triumph of holy fire over abomination. The smoke that rose from the clay vessels was purification. The screams, if any sound escaped before the end, were the death throes of evil being driven from the world. In this manner, one of the most intelligent, gentle races on the continent was driven to near extinction a second time. Artipo, those who survived did so through absolute commitment to their disguises. A Doppler living in Novigrad could not afford to be discovered. One moment of carelessness, a transformation interrupted, a slip back into natural form, contact with silver at the wrong time meant death. Not a clean death either, but death designed to serve as warning to others. Death as theater. This created a peculiar condition. Dopplers became invisible not through magic, but through necessity. They learned every detail of the forms they wore. They studied human behavior with the intensity of scholars, because their lives depended on perfect performance. A merchant Doppler needed to know not just how merchants spoke, but how they moved, what they valued, which small gestures signaled membership in the community. And they needed to do this while carrying the knowledge that humans would kill them for succeeding. The contradiction was absolute. Dopplers were persecuted for their ability to impersonate humans, yet their survival required perfect impersonation. They were hunted for being different, yet they could only survive by being indistinguishable. The very trait that made them monsters in human eyes was the trait that allowed them to live undetected among those who would destroy them if they knew the truth. This was the world a Doppler named Tellico Lunngrevink Letorte, though his friends would call him Dudu, had survived into. The details of Doppler reproduction and life cycles were obscure even to those who studied them. Whether Dopplers were born in any conventional sense or came into being through some other process remained unknown. What was certain, Dudu had lived long enough to remember the plateau before Novigrad consumed it, long enough to have taken wolf form during winters when the forest still dominated the region, long enough to have witnessed the transition from pre-human wilderness to human city, long enough to have survived what most of his kind did not. When humans first arrived, Dudu had fled with many others. Accounts attributed to him gathered from later conversations with a witcher who would, against considerable odds, become something like a friend, described transforming into a wolf and running with a pack for several weeks, living as a wolf, hunting as a wolf, fighting with other wolves over territory and mates and hierarchy, surviving as a wolf because wolves were not hunted the way Dopplers were. But winter ended, the pack moved on, and Dudu, like the other surviving Dopplers, faced the reality that the wilderness was no longer refuge. Human settlement had spread too far. The forests that remained were too sparse, the territories too fractured. A lone Doppler in the wild was vulnerable in ways a wolf in a pack was not. Novigrad, for all its dangers, offered crowds. The city offered possibility. It offered the chance to do more than merely survive, to live with some degree of purpose beyond constant flight. Dwarves had done it. Halflings had done it. Even elves, despite the wars and the bitterness, had found ways to exist in human spaces. Why, Dudu would later ask, should Dopplers be denied that right? The question was reasonable. The answer was not. Dopplers were denied because humans decided they should be denied, because the church declared it, because fear, once weaponized, does not require justification beyond its own perpetuation, because it was easier to maintain the idea that Dopplers were threats than to examine whether the threat had ever been real. In the years after the first landing, as Novigrad grew from settlement to city to metropolis, the Doppler population dwindled. How many survived cannot be known with certainty. Dopplers who lived did so by ensuring no count could be made. But the pattern was clear. What had once been a thriving population on the plateau had been reduced to scattered individuals hiding in the spaces humans created but did not fully see. One Doppler who survived would later describe himself as one of the few, though whether this meant tens or hundreds or some number in between remained deliberately vague. A beggar on a corner, unchanged in appearance for 3 years, whom no one noticed enough to question. A merchant's cousin, conveniently appearing when business required an extra hand. A servant in a noble house, competent but unremarkable. A priest who preached with unexpected compassion, but never rose too far in the church hierarchy. They lived in the gaps, and in living there, they kept the lives humans could not or would not keep for themselves. This was not parasitism. though humans would later use that word. A parasite takes without giving. A doppler, wearing another's form, often improved the situation of the one they mimicked. A struggling merchant might find, upon reclaiming his identity from a doppler, that his business had mysteriously prospered. Investments made during the doppler's tenure would yield returns the merchant himself would never have anticipated. This was not theft, exactly. Or if it was theft that left the victim richer than before. But humans did not appreciate the distinction. The case of the halfling merchant Dani Bibervelt would illustrate this paradox precisely. Ambushed outside Novigrad by a doppler, knocked unconscious, and left in a ditch, Dainty would spend days traveling back to the city on foot, while the doppler, Dudu, as it happened, sold Dainty's horses, invested the proceeds in seemingly random goods, and made business decisions that would, within days, generate profits exceeding anything Dainty had earned in years. Dainty, upon learning of these profits, would be furious. Then he would be confused. Then, eventually, he would make the doppler his business partner. The progression made sense if one thought about it practically. A doppler who could copy not just appearance, but also skills and intuition, could potentially operate as a superior version of the original. Not because the doppler was inherently better, but because the doppler could access the person's capabilities without the person's doubts, without the accumulated weight of past failures, without the fear that constrained decision-making. A merchant who hesitated might, in doppler form, act decisively. A guard who compromised might, in doppler form, uphold principles. A priest who hoarded power might, in doppler form, exercise compassion. The doppler copied what was there but seemed to emphasize what was good. This was the paradox that would define their existence in human cities. Dopplers could not understand evil, not in the way humans performed it. They could copy a cruel man's appearance, his voice, his mannerisms. They could wield his sword with his skill, but they could not replicate the willingness to inflict harm for harm's sake, the casual cruelty, the pleasure taken in another's suffering. When Dudu transformed into Geralt of Rivia, a witcher, a man trained from childhood to kill, the doppler gained access to Geralt's combat abilities, the signs, the swordsmanship, the tactical thinking. But when Geralt told Dudu to surrender, that he could not win because he lacked the capacity to truly fight as Geralt would fight, Dudu understood immediately. Because Geralt was right. Dudu could look like Geralt, could move like Geralt, could even think for a moment like Geralt. But Dudu could not be willing to kill in cold blood the way a witcher sometimes had to, could not carry the specific hardness that made Geralt effective at his profession, could not access whatever place in Geralt's psychology allowed him to make the calculations necessary for survival in a world that rewarded violence. The doppler could copy the skill but not the edge. This limitation was not weakness, or it was weakness only if one accepted that the capacity for cruelty was strength. The question of memory haunted every transformation. When a doppler took a new form, they gained skills instantaneously. A merchant's understanding of markets, a soldier's muscle memory for sword forms, a priest's knowledge of liturgy, but the mechanism remained unclear, whether this constituted true memory or something else, something closer to intuition, an imprint rather than a recording. Dudu knew which banker Dainty used, knew the tavern Dainty frequented, knew the routes through Novigrad's market that a halfling merchant would prefer. Whether this knowledge came from actual memory, transferred during transformation, or from some deeper instinct that emerged when wearing Dainty's form, or from the brief access to thoughts Dudu described, the question had no certain answer. The Dopplers themselves seemed uncertain of the mechanism. The distinction mattered. If Dopplers truly absorbed memories, then every transformation carried the weight of another life. Every person copied left their mark, layering experience upon experience until the Doppler's original self, if such a thing existed, became buried under accumulated identities. But if the knowledge was merely intuitive, arising from the form itself without the substance of lived experience, then Dopplers remained fundamentally themselves regardless of how many shapes they wore. The truth likely fell somewhere between. When Dudu transformed, he briefly touched the thoughts of the person he copied. Not their entire history, not their childhood or their deepest secrets, but the active surface, what they were thinking in that moment, what concerned them, what they valued. Enough to wear the person convincingly, enough to make the choices they would make in a given situation, but only enough. A Doppler could not, for instance, recall specific conversations the original person had experienced unless those conversations were actively on the person's mind during the transformation, could not access passwords or hidden knowledge unless the person happened to be thinking about them, could not predict how the person would react to entirely new situations beyond extrapolating from the personality traits and behavioral patterns that came with the form. This created gaps, small ones usually, easily explained away as distraction or forgetfulness, the sort of minor inconsistencies that humans overlooked because humans themselves were inconsistent. A merchant who forgot a customer's name, a guard who failed to recognize a regular visitor, a friend who seemed slightly distant, slightly off, but chalked it up to a bad day. Dopplers survived in these gaps. They learned to navigate the spaces where human memory itself was unreliable enough that their own limitations would not betray them. They became experts in the art of plausible deflection, of answering questions with questions, of steering conversations toward topics where their borrowed knowledge was strongest and away from areas where it grew thin. In this way, Dopplers became better at being human than many humans were, not because they possessed superior abilities, but because they had to. Because a human could afford to be forgetful, inconsistent, distracted. A Doppler could not. Every interaction was a test. Every conversation, a potential exposure. The stakes for failure were not embarrassment or social awkwardness, but death in clay vessels heated until the body burst. So Dopplers paid attention. They noticed the small details humans overlooked in themselves. The way a person's posture changed when lying. The slight hesitation before using a particular word. The unconscious habits, tapping fingers, shifting weight, avoiding eye contact, that signaled discomfort or uncertainty. Dopplers copied these details perfectly because copying perfectly was survival. But they also learned something else. They learned what humans wanted to be. When Dudu wore Dainty's form and made business decisions, he made them not based on what Dainty had done before, but based on what Dainty wished he had the courage to do. The risky investments, the bold moves, the choices that carried potential for either profit or ruin, but promised something greater than safety. Dainty, upon learning of these decisions, was initially furious at the risk. Then he saw the returns. Then he realized that the Doppler had acted as he himself would have acted if he were braver, if he trusted his own judgment more, if he allowed himself to make the moves he knew were correct, but had always hesitated to commit to. The Doppler had been more dainty than Dainty himself. This was not unique to Dudu and Dainty. The pattern repeated wherever Dopplers survived long enough to build stable identities. They did not simply mimic, they refined. They took the person's best qualities and operated from those qualities without the person's worst impulses interfering. A Doppler wearing a corrupt guard's form might enforce the law fairly. A Doppler wearing a cruel merchant's form might conduct business honestly. A Doppler wearing a coward's form might act bravely. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough that the pattern was noticeable, because Dopplers copied what they understood, and what they understood was goodness. Cruelty remained alien to them. A Doppler could recognize that a person was cruel, could see the effects of that cruelty in the person's life and relationships, but could not internalize the motivation behind it, could not access whatever psychological mechanism allowed humans to derive satisfaction from causing pain, could not comprehend why someone would choose to harm when they could choose otherwise. This created a curious effect. A Doppler wearing a cruel person's form would appear, to close observers, to have undergone some change of heart, would seem reformed, softer, more considerate. Not dramatically so. Dopplers were too skilled at mimicry to make obvious breaks with established behavior, but enough that those who knew the person well might comment on it. He's mellowed, they might say. Something's changed. And something had changed, though not in the way they imagined. The person had not reformed. The person had been replaced, temporarily, by something that could wear his face but not his capacity for malice. And in that replacement, those around him glimpsed what he might have been if he chose differently. What he could be, perhaps, if whatever twisted him could be untangled. Dopplers, unwittingly, offered humans a mirror, not of what they were, but of what they carried potential to become. This was perhaps the deepest irony of their persecution. Humans feared Dopplers for their ability to impersonate, but the impersonation often revealed the truth of what was being copied. stripped the person down to their essential character, showed what remained when the layers of habit and hurt and accumulated compromise were removed. And what remained, reflected through a Doppler's understanding, was usually better than what the original displayed. The implications unsettled those who thought about them carefully. If a Doppler could wear someone's form and be kinder, braver, more honest than the original, what did that suggest about human nature? That goodness was fundamental and cruelty was the distortion? That people chose to be worse than they had to be? That the impediment to better behavior was not lack of capacity, but lack of will? These were not comfortable questions, particularly for those who benefited from systems built on casual cruelty, for merchants who exploited workers, for nobles who abused privileges, for priests who weaponized doctrine. The existence of Dopplers, of creatures that could wear their forms and behave better while doing so, implicitly accused them of choosing poorly. So they burned the Dopplers instead, called them abominations, monsters, threats to the social order that required elimination, because eliminating Dopplers was simpler than examining what the Dopplers revealed about humanity itself. Fear of replacement became the justification. The stated concern was that Dopplers could infiltrate positions of power, could replace leaders, merchants, guards, could manipulate human society from within, wearing human faces while pursuing alien agendas. This fear was not entirely baseless. A Doppler theoretically could do these things, but it ignored the observable reality. Dopplers did not seek power. When they took positions of influence, they did not abuse those positions. The Doppler who replaced a corrupt official typically governed more fairly than the original. The Doppler who operated as a merchant typically traded more honestly. The Doppler who served in a guard post typically enforced law more consistently. This was not a conspiracy to undermine human society. This was simply how Dopplers operated when given the chance. But fear does not operate on evidence. Fear operates on possibility. And the possibility that a Doppler could, if it chose, cause harm was sufficient to justify persecution, regardless of whether any Doppler actually made that choice. One case exemplified this pattern precisely. The man known as Chappelle served as head of Novigrad's secret service. His reputation was well established, ruthless, efficient, willing to employ torture, extortion, and blackmail as routine tools of his office. He maintained order through fear. He confiscated property without hesitation. He disappeared people who posed inconvenient questions. He was, by most measures, a monster wearing a human face. Then he suffered a heart attack and died. A Doppler, present when this occurred, saw an opportunity, saw a position of power that could be used differently, saw a form that would grant protection and influence, saw the chance to do something other than merely survive in the margins. The Doppler took Chappelle's form and resumed his duties. Outwardly, nothing changed. The Doppler maintained Chappelle's public persona, the harsh demeanor, the intimidating presence, the reputation for ruthlessness. But the actual execution of policy shifted. The secret police became less brutal. Torture became less common. Non-humans found themselves facing less persecution. The machinery of oppression that Chappelle had built began, subtly, to dismantle itself from within. Some noticed the change. "He's had an attack," they said. Changed him somehow. And they were not wrong, though the change was not what they imagined. For approximately 2 months, Novigrad was governed by a secret police chief who looked like Chappelle, spoke like Chappelle, and acted with Chappelle's authority, but who operated from principles Chappelle had never held. The Doppler used Chappelle's power to ease suffering rather than inflict it, used his position to protect rather than to purge. No one suspected. The mimicry was perfect. The Doppler knew how to perform cruelty convincingly when necessary to maintain the disguise, knew which prisoners to abuse publicly to maintain reputation, knew which displays of force were required to preserve authority. The Doppler did these things with precisely the same outward appearance as Chappelle himself would have displayed, but the overall effect was gentler. Fewer arrests, fewer disappearances, fewer bodies found in the river with signs of torture. Not none, the Doppler could not eliminate the system entirely without exposing himself, but fewer. And in a city like Novigrad, fewer deaths was victory. This lasted until Caleb Menge took command of the Temple Guard. Menge was ambitious, fanatical, observant. He noticed the subtle shift in Chappelle's behavior, not obvious enough to alert most observers, but present enough to raise questions for someone looking carefully. He investigated. He gathered evidence. He performed the test that Dopplers could not pass: silver. When presented with a silver vessel to drink from, the Doppler hesitated. Just for a moment. Just long enough for Menge to see the reaction and understand its meaning. The real Chappelle would not have hesitated. The real Chappelle had no reason to fear silver. A Doppler did. Menge moved quickly, arrested the Doppler before transformation could occur, imprisoned him in chains mixed with silver filings to prevent escape, and then, to solidify his own position and demonstrate his devotion to the Eternal Fire's doctrine, Menge staged a public execution. In Hierarch Square, before a crowd gathered to witness holy justice, Menge burned two figures at the stake: a sorceress named Felicia Corey and the Doppler who had worn Chappelle's face. The crowd was told this was purification. The smoke that rose from the pyres was blessed. The screams, if there were screams, were the sounds of evil departing the world, and Novigrad returned to rule by the actual Caleb Menge, whose brutality made even the original Chappelle seem almost merciful by comparison. The persecutions intensified. The witch hunts accelerated. The pyres burned constantly in the square, fed with mages and non-humans, and anyone who attracted the wrong attention. This was presented as restoration of proper order. A Doppler had infiltrated the highest levels of power, the church declared, had manipulated the city's defenses from within, had nearly succeeded in undermining the Eternal Fire's protection, that the infiltration had resulted in less cruelty, fewer deaths, gentler governance. These facts were not mentioned, or if mentioned, were presented as evidence of the Doppler's insidious nature, as proof that Dopplers were dangerous precisely because they could make evil appear good. The logic was circular but effective. Dopplers were dangerous because they could replace humans. Their replacement was dangerous because it revealed that the humans they replaced were worse than their copies. Therefore, Dopplers must be eliminated to protect humans from the knowledge of their own failures. Stated plainly, the argument collapsed. But it was not stated plainly. It was stated in the language of holy doctrine, of public safety, of protecting civilization from monstrous infiltration. And in that language, with pyres burning in the square as visual reinforcement, the argument was accepted. Fear does not require logic. Fear requires only repetition, and the willingness to inflict violence on those who question. The Doppler population in Novigrad, already small, dwindled further. Those who survived did so by becoming even more cautious, even more committed to their disguises, even more invisible. They abandoned any thought of using their abilities to improve the lives they borrowed. Survival became the only goal, and in surviving, they became what humans accused them of being: parasites who took forms without giving anything back. Not because this was their nature, but because every attempt to give something back had been punished with death. Dudu understood the stakes better than most. His encounter with the Witcher Geralt had begun as disaster: captured, exposed, facing immediate execution or forced exile from the only refuge he knew. But it had ended, through a series of unlikely complications, with something that might cautiously be called acceptance. Dainty Bibervelt, the halfling merchant whose identity Dudu had stolen, and whose business he had inadvertently improved, had agreed to present Dudu publicly as his cousin. Not his true cousin, obviously. Dainty had no such relative, but a convenient fiction that allowed Dudu to remain in Novigrad legally, operating openly under the name Dudu Bibervelt. The arrangement benefited both parties. Dainty gained a business partner whose instincts proved consistently profitable. Dudu gained protection under Dainty's reputation and standing in the merchant community. Together, they prospered in ways neither could have managed alone. It was, by any reasonable measure, a successful partnership, but it required Dudu to maintain the halfling form permanently, or near permanently. In private moments, in secure locations where observation was impossible, Dudu could briefly return to his natural state, could remember what it felt like to have yellow eyes and elongated limbs, to be the shape that was fundamentally his own rather than a borrowed outline. But these moments were rare. The rest of the time, the vast majority of his existence, Dudu was a halfling, moved like a halfling, thought like a halfling, to the extent that prolonged transformation allowed habits to settle into patterns that became nearly permanent. He spoke common with a halfling's accent, ate food that halflings preferred, adopted halfling gestures and mannerisms so completely that even close observation would reveal nothing false. This was not merely performance. This was transformation at a depth that blurred the line between pretending and being. The question that haunted Dudu, though he rarely articulated it even to himself, was how much of him remained beneath the form. If he wore Dainty's cousin's appearance for years, for decades, would he eventually forget what his natural form felt like? Would the Doppler self become the costume, and the halfling self become the truth? The question had no answer, because no Doppler had survived long enough in stable circumstances to test it. Dopplers who lived openly in one form typically did so only briefly before exposure, capture, execution. Dopplers who survived long-term did so by constantly changing forms, never staying in any one identity long enough to be traced. Dudu's situation, living openly, continuously, in a single, borrowed identity with the full knowledge and cooperation of the person whose family he claimed, was unprecedented. Or if not unprecedented, then at least rare enough that no established wisdom existed to guide him. He was making his own path, and the path was lonely, in ways that had nothing to do with social isolation. Dudu had friends, had business relationships, had the camaraderie that came from successful merchant partnerships, but he could not be known. Not truly. Every interaction required maintaining the halfling identity. Every conversation was filtered through the question, can I say this without breaking character? The loneliness was not absence of company, but absence of recognition. No one saw Dudu. They saw Dainty's cousin. They saw the halfling merchant who made clever investments. They saw the friendly face in the market who could be counted on for fair dealing. All of which was true in its way, but none of which was the whole truth. The whole truth was shapeshifter, survivor, one of perhaps dozens of his kind left alive on the entire continent, member of a race that humans had driven to near extinction twice over, once through direct hunting, once through cultural erasure, but the whole truth could not be spoken. So Dudu lived in the partial truth of his borrowed name and tried not to think too carefully about what he was losing in the process. Other Dopplers faced different versions of the same problem. The one who had written the letter about living as a beggar for 3 years, if that account was accurate, had achieved a different kind of invisibility. Beggars were beneath notice. They occupied street corners and alcoves, present but unobserved, part of the urban landscape rather than active participants in city life. A beggar could maintain the same appearance indefinitely because no one paid attention closely enough to notice that the beggar never aged, never changed, never moved to a different corner or altered their routine. This was survival through erasure. The beggar existed, but only barely. Lived in a space so marginal that transformation was unnecessary. The original form, perhaps modified only slightly to appear more human, could be maintained because no one cared enough to look closely. But this was not living. Not in any meaningful sense. It was enduring, persisting, maintaining biological function while waiting for something that might never come. Other Dopplers had presumably found other niches. Servants in large households, where turnover was common enough that a replacement would not be questioned. Merchants in distant cities, where the person they replaced had few close relationships, and the imposture could be maintained indefinitely. Criminals operating under false names, where identity itself was fluid and no one expected consistency. Each survival strategy carried its own costs. The household servant lived in comfort and stability, but in positions of servitude, at the mercy of employers who would kill them if the truth emerged. The distant merchant lived freely, but in isolation, cut off from others of their kind. The criminal lived with constant risk, one step ahead of both the law and the criminal elements who would exploit a Doppler's abilities if they learned the truth. There was no good option, only varieties of compromise, each weighing safety against autonomy, survival against authenticity, the life they lived against the life they could not have. And underlying all of it was the knowledge that humanity would not change. Dopplers would not be granted rights, would not be recognized as intelligent beings deserving of protection under law, would not be allowed to exist openly in their natural forms. The persecution might wax or wane depending on political conditions, might intensify under zealots like Caleb Menge, might ease slightly under more pragmatic leaders, but it would never end entirely, because the fear was too useful. Dopplers served as a perpetual threat, a shapeshifter in the shadows, a monster that could be anyone. This fear could be deployed whenever those in power needed to justify increased security, expanded surveillance, harsher penalties for nonconformity. The actual number of Dopplers was irrelevant. The actual danger they posed was irrelevant. What mattered was the idea of the Doppler, the infiltrator, the imposter, the enemy that looked like a friend. As long as that idea retained power, Dopplers would be persecuted. And as long as Dopplers were persecuted, they would have to hide. And in hiding, they would confirm the fear that justified the persecution. The cycle was perfect in its cruelty. Dudu understood this cycle intellectually, understood that his survival depended on invisibility, understood that attempting to advocate for Doppler rights, to argue for recognition as an intelligent race, to suggest that persecution was unjust, any of these actions would result in immediate exposure and death. But understanding did not prevent the question from surfacing during quiet moments. What would happen if Dopplers simply stopped hiding? Not in aggression, not in confrontation, but simply in existence. If every surviving Doppler simultaneously revealed themselves and refused to transform, refused to pretend, refused to participate in the fiction that they were the humans they imitated, what would humanity do? The likely answer was massacre. Dopplers numbered in the dozens at most, humans numbered in the millions. If it came to open conflict, the outcome was certain. Dopplers had no weapons beyond their ability to mimic, no unified leadership, no territory to defend, no allies who would risk themselves to protect beings labeled as monsters by every major religious and political institution on the continent. They would be exterminated within weeks. So the question remained theoretical, a thought experiment with no practical application. Dopplers would continue hiding, because hiding was the only option that allowed survival, would continue performing their borrowed identities because performance was the price of existence. And in performing, they might preserve something that could be called culture, though the word fit poorly. What passed for Doppler culture, to the extent it existed at all, consisted of survival techniques passed between individuals in the rare moments when two Dopplers recognized each other, how to maintain a transformation over extended periods, how to deflect questions about memories that should exist but didn't, how to recognize silver before touching it, how to identify safe spaces for brief returns to natural form, how to interpret the subtle signals other Dopplers might use to identify themselves to one another without alerting the humans around them. Whether such signals actually existed, or whether Dopplers remained too isolated to develop them, was itself uncertain. Beyond these practical teachings, little remained. No shared history, because Dopplers could not gather to share history without risking exposure. No artistic tradition, because art required stability, and Dopplers lived in constant flux. No philosophy, because philosophy required the luxury of abstract thought, and Dopplers needed every mental resource focused on immediate survival. What remained was memory. Individual Dopplers carried memories of the plateau, of the time before humans, of the winters spent as wolves in packs that accepted them without question. These memories, imperfect and incomplete, passed between Dopplers in fragments. Stories told quickly in hidden moments. Images shared through brief transformations when Dopplers copied each other, and, in doing so, accessed the other's experiences. The memories were eroding. However Dopplers came into existence, whether through reproduction, transformation, or some other means, the pattern was clear. Those who survived remembered less of what came before with each passing generation. If generation was even the right word for a population too scattered and persecuted to maintain stable communities. Dudu remembered being a wolf, remembered the plateau, but others, if any existed, who had not experienced those times directly, would have been born or come into being in a world where the plateau was already city, where being a wolf was already impossibly dangerous, where Novigrad was the only reality they knew. They would not remember what was lost, they would only know hiding. This was perhaps the deepest tragedy of the persecution. Not the deaths, though those were tragic enough. Not the fear, though that was corrosive, but the erasure, the systematic elimination not just of Doppler bodies, but of Doppler memory, Doppler culture, Doppler existence, as anything other than parasitic impersonators hiding in the margins of human society. In another few generations, Dopplers might survive only as the thing humans accuse them of being, creatures with no identity of their own, no history, no future beyond the next transformation, nothing but the borrowed names and borrowed lives they wore to avoid execution. The irony was that humans would call this justice, would call it the natural order reasserting itself, the elimination of a threat, the triumph of civilization over monstrosity. They would not recognize it as cultural genocide, because they had never recognized Doppler culture as real, had never acknowledged that Dopplers were anything other than mimics, copies without originals, echoes without voices, and Dopplers, hiding in human forms, could not correct this misunderstanding without dying. So the misunderstanding persisted and would continue to persist until the last Doppler either died or forgot that they were anything other than the human they pretended to be. Dudu thought about this sometimes, in the quiet hours when the market was closed, and Dainty had retired to his own quarters, and the halfling form Dudu wore felt less like a costume and more like a cage. Thought about what would be lost when the last Doppler who remembered the plateau finally died. Thought about whether the Dopplers who came after, if any came after, would even know that something had been lost. Probably not. They would live in their human forms and think this was normal, think this was simply what Dopplers were, would not know that their ancestors had once lived freely, had once chosen their forms rather than being forced into them, had once been part of the world rather than parasites clinging to its edges. The knowledge would die with Dudu's generation, and humanity would never know what it had destroyed. Or perhaps humanity would know but would not care, which was worse. The Witcher asked the Doppler a question, not the question about surrender, though that would come later. Not the question about whether Dopplers deserved to live in cities, though that had already been answered through Geralt's refusal to kill intelligent beings. A different question, simpler and more complicated. What do you want? Dudu, wearing Dandelion's form at that moment, hat with feather, lute strapped across his back, standing in the Novigrad market with crowds flowing past, considered the question carefully. I want to survive, he said. I want to roam about somewhere other than wilderness. I want to winter in shelter, rather than beneath fallen trees. I want to not be forever hungry. Basic needs, fundamental requirements for existence. Nothing ambitious, nothing that required taking anything from humans that humans were not already taking from each other. Geralt nodded slowly, then Dudu added the rest. I want what you gave to dwarves, halflings, gnomes, and even elves. The modest possibility of assimilation. Why should I be any worse off? Why am I denied that right? The question was not rhetorical. Geralt had no answer that did not condemn the world he lived in. Dwarves, for all the prejudice they faced, could at least exist openly, could own businesses, form communities, pass their culture to their children. The same was true for halflings, for gnomes, even for elves who chose to live in human cities rather than resist in the wilderness. But not Dopplers. Dopplers could exist only by pretending to be something else, could survive only by erasing themselves, could live only by accepting that their existence itself was crime enough to warrant execution. The injustice was obvious once stated plainly, but stating it plainly changed nothing, because the persecution was not based on justice, was not based on any rational assessment of threat or harm, was based on fear, and fear was not answered by logic. Still, the question lingered. What did Dopplers want? The answer, drawn from multiple accounts of Doppler interactions with humans, was remarkably consistent. To exist, to be allowed the same modest place in society that other non-humans had carved out through centuries of negotiation, compromise, and survival. To not be hunted, to not be burned, to not have to choose between hiding forever and dying in clay vessels. This was not ambition. This was the bare minimum required for life, and it was denied. The question then became, what did Dopplers actually keep when they borrowed human lives? Not possessions. Dudu sold Dainty's horses, but used the proceeds for investments that ultimately benefited Dainty. The Chappelle Doppler used his authority, but used it to reduce suffering rather than increase his own power. Dopplers who worked as servants performed their duties faithfully. Dopplers who operated as merchants traded honestly. What they kept was harder to define. One reading of the evidence, Dopplers retained something like the memory of kindness. When they copied humans, they seemed to emphasize the moments of grace, the decisions made from compassion rather than calculation, the small acts of generosity that the original person might have performed if circumstances had allowed. whether this was intentional selection, unconscious filtering, or simply the limitation Geralt had identified, that Dopplers could only copy what they understood. The effect was observable even if the mechanism was not. A guard who looked the other way when a child stole bread to eat. A merchant who gave fair price rather than gouging during shortage. A priest who offered comfort without demanding conversion. These moments existed in most humans, buried under the accumulated weight of compromise and cynicism, and the daily calculations required to navigate systems built on exploitation. If Dopplers truly copied the person without copying that weight, they might act from those better impulses without the interference of everything else. This would explain why Doppler impersonations so often seemed like improvements on the originals, not because Dopplers were superior beings, but because they accessed only what they could comprehend, and cruelty was incomprehensible to them. Geralt had seen this pattern in Dudu, had recognized it during their confrontation. A Doppler who could have killed Dainty and buried the body, securing perfect safety, but chose not to because taking a life was incomprehensible to him. A Doppler who, when cornered and desperate, transformed into a Witcher and gained access to all of Geralt's combat abilities, but could not commit to using those abilities lethally because violence for its own sake was foreign to Doppler nature. "You only know how to copy what's good in us," Geralt had said, "because you don't understand the bad in us." It was observation, not accusation. And it was true. Dopplers did not understand cruelty, didn't understand the human capacity to harm others not from necessity but from choice, did not understand how someone could recognize another being's suffering and choose to increase it. This incomprehension was not naivete. Dopplers witnessed cruelty constantly, lived under threat of it, died from it, but a fundamental inability to access the psychological mechanism that allowed it. They could see cruelty's effects, could recognize that certain humans were dangerous, could even predict to some extent how cruel individuals would behave in given situations, but they could not become cruel themselves, even when wearing the form of someone whose entire identity was built on inflicting harm. This limitation made them vulnerable, made them unable to defend themselves effectively against humans who had no such limitation, made them incapable of the ruthlessness that survival in human societies often required, made them in essence perpetual outsiders even when wearing perfect disguises, but it also made them valuable in ways humans rarely acknowledged. A Doppler in a position of power was a correction mechanism, a brief reprieve from the cycles of abuse that human hierarchies enabled. The Chappelle Doppler proved this. 2 months of gentler governance, fewer deaths, less persecution. Not a solution to systemic problems, but a demonstration that those problems were not inevitable. That authority could be exercised differently. That power could serve protection rather than domination. Humans killed him for demonstrating this, burned him in public as proof that infiltration had occurred and been defeated, used his execution to justify increasing the very persecution he had briefly eased, made his attempt to improve things into evidence that Dopplers were dangerous precisely because they made bad systems appear capable of good. The lesson was clear. Dopplers were not being persecuted for the harm they caused. They were being persecuted for the good they revealed was possible. This realization did not change anything, did not make Dopplers safer, did not suggest any strategy for survival beyond the ones already employed, but it clarified the stakes, made explicit what had always been implicit, that Doppler persecution was not about Dopplers at all, but about maintaining human hierarchies that required certain cruelties to function. Dopplers threatened those hierarchies not through violence or infiltration, but through demonstration, by being kinder than the people they copied, by making better choices with the same information, by showing that the excuse of human nature was not sufficient to explain human behavior, because something that could copy human nature without copying human cruelty proved that cruelty was not inherent to the nature, but added to it. This made Dopplers dangerous to the status quo, and so the status quo killed them. The killing would continue, would probably accelerate as human kingdoms consolidated power and religious institutions gained authority. The brief period of relative tolerance that had allowed Dopplers like Dudu to survive openly, even if under false names, seemed to be ending. The witch hunts that had begun in Novigrad under Caleb Menge's command showed what was coming. The pyres that burned mages would burn Dopplers too, with even less protest because Dopplers had no colleges, no lodges, no organized defense. They had only hiding. And hiding would become harder as kingdoms developed better documentation, as bureaucracies tracked identities more carefully, as silver tests became standard procedure for anyone in positions of responsibility. The margins where Dopplers survived were closing. The gaps where they could exist without detection were narrowing. Where this would lead, whether to extinction or to some new form of survival, could not be predicted with certainty. But the trajectory was not encouraging, or they might survive only as legends. Stories told by humans about shapeshifters who once walked among them. Tales that grew more fantastic with each telling, until the real Dopplers, gentle, intelligent, good-natured beings who wanted only to live without persecution, were forgotten entirely, replaced by monsters from nightmares who stole faces and corrupted cities. This was already happening, the transformation from reality to myth, occurring within living memory. Human stories about Dopplers focused on the threat of infiltration, on the horror of discovering that someone was not who they appeared to be, on the violation of trust that imposture represented. These stories never acknowledged that Dopplers impersonated humans because humans would kill them otherwise. Never mentioned that most Doppler infiltration improved the situations they entered. Never considered that the real horror might be what it said about humanity, that beings had to impersonate humans to survive humans. The stories humans told about Dopplers were stories humans told about themselves, about their fears of betrayal, about their inability to trust, about their conviction that anything different must be dangerous, about their need to believe that cruelty was justified because the alternatives were too terrible to contemplate. Dopplers became the screen onto which humans projected their own worst qualities, then punished the Dopplers for reflecting them. This would be their legacy, not the plateau where they lived peacefully before humans arrived, not the winters spent as wolves in packs that accepted them, not the kindness they showed when wearing human forms, not the good they did when given opportunity, not the gentleness that characterized their nature. None of that would be remembered. Only the fear would remain. Only the stories of infiltration and imposture. Only the executions and the pyres and the clay vessels heated until they burst. Only the warning passed from generation to generation. Beware the Doppler, the shapeshifter, the monster that steals your face. And somewhere, hidden in the crowds of human cities, the last few Dopplers would hear these stories and know they were lies. But they would not correct them. They would only hide deeper, maintain their disguises more carefully, hold on to their borrowed names and borrowed lives, and pretend that this was enough. That survival, even survival that required erasing everything they were, was better than the alternative. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps mere existence, even existence as permanent impersonators, even existence that required abandoning any hope of being known, or recognized, or allowed to live openly, perhaps that was worth preserving, worth the compromises and the loneliness and the slow erosion of identity that came from wearing other faces for decades at a time. Or perhaps they were wrong, and extinction with dignity was preferable to survival through erasure. The question had no answer that applied to everyone. Each Doppler had to decide individually what they were willing to sacrifice, what they were willing to become, how much of themselves they could abandon and still call what remained a self-worth preserving. Dudu had made his choice. He would live as Dainty's cousin, would operate as a merchant, would contribute to human society in the ways that society allowed, would take the modest possibility of assimilation that Geralt had said Dopplers deserved, even if that possibility came with the requirement of pretending to be someone he was not. It was not the life he would have chosen if choice were truly available, but it was a life, and in a world where most of his kind had no life at all, where the alternative was death in clay vessels, or endless flight through wilderness that no longer offered sanctuary, a life, even a borrowed one, was worth keeping. The market in Novigrad continued its daily rhythm. Merchants called their wares. Guards maintained order. Priests preached about the eternal fire. Dwarves negotiated in their banks. Halflings conducted their trades. Elves moved through the crowds, faces closed against the casual prejudice they endured. And among them, undetected, a few Dopplers maintained their careful disguises, living borrowed lives, keeping borrowed names, preserving, in the only way available to them, the memory that once they had been something other than copies, that once they had existed in their own forms without fear, that once the world had been large enough to include them, that memory was fading, with each doppler who died, with each generation that forgot, with each compromise that made survival possible but authenticity impossible. Soon the memory would be gone entirely, and when it was gone, when the last doppler who remembered the plateau finally died, when nothing remained except the borrowed lives and the human stories about shapeshifter monsters, then the extinction would be complete in its most fundamental form, not necessarily of doppler bodies. A few might survive in hiding indefinitely, maintaining their disguises, passing undetected through human cities for decades or centuries more. But extinction of doppler existence as something distinct, as something with its own validity, as something that deserved to exist on its own terms, rather than on terms humans dictated. That extinction was already underway, had been since the first landing, would continue until it was finished. The only question was whether anyone would notice, whether anyone would recognize that something had been lost, whether the absence of dopplers would leave a gap that humans could perceive, whether the world would be diminished by having only humans and the races humans tolerated, without the gentle shapeshifters who copied goodness because they could not comprehend cruelty. The answer seemed likely to be no, given how thoroughly humans had convinced themselves that dopplers were threats rather than mirrors. But certainty was impossible. Humans would likely continue as they had, telling stories about the monsters they had defeated, burning pyres to commemorate their triumphs, building their cities on the plateau where dopplers had once lived freely. Whether they would ever know what they had destroyed, whether they would ever recognize that the creatures they feared most were the ones who had tried to show them the best versions of themselves, seemed doubtful. The persecution had been too thorough, the justifications too deeply embedded, the fear too useful to abandon. The dopplers knew, would always know, would carry that knowledge hidden beneath their borrowed faces, unable to speak it, unable to share it, unable to make it matter. What a Witcher had observed, that they could only copy the good because they could not understand the bad, had become both their defining trait and their doom. The very limitation that made them harmless made them dangerous to systems that required believing cruelty was inevitable. They would keep the secret of what they were, and in keeping it, they would keep the lives humans gave them, because those were the only lives available. This was not justice, but it was survival. And survival, for dopplers, had always required accepting that justice was not coming, that recognition was not coming, that the world would not change to accommodate them, so they would have to change to survive the world. They had changed, were changing still, would continue changing until nothing remained that humans could distinguish from themselves. And then perhaps they would finally be safe, or perhaps they would finally be extinct, and the distinction would no longer matter. Spring returned. Rain fell on the roads. Hearts were warmed by heat of the sun. The words came from a ballad composed by a poet who had never known he was speaking for those who could not speak for themselves. The eternal fire, he called it. Not the fire that burned in Novigrad's temples and pyres, but the fire that burned in all living things. The hope that could not be extinguished as long as life persisted. Dopplers understood this fire differently than humans did. For humans, hope meant progress toward better futures, meant change and improvement, and the possibility that tomorrow would bring something new. For dopplers, hope meant only that tomorrow would bring more of what today had brought. More hiding, more borrowed lives, more pretending that survival in the margins was victory enough. But it was still hope, still the refusal to surrender entirely, still the commitment to persist even when persistence required abandoning everything, except the fundamental insistence that existing, somehow, anyhow, was worthwhile. The fire still burned, not brightly, not in ways that humans could see or would recognize, but burning nonetheless, in the hearts of beings who had every reason to give up and chose not to. That was worth remembering, that somewhere in Novigrad's markets, in its taverns, in its merchant houses and guard posts and servant quarters, dopplers continued their careful masquerade, continued preserving something that humans had tried to eliminate, continued demonstrating, to no one who could acknowledge it, that kindness was possible even in forms designed for cruelty. They kept the lives humans gave them, and in keeping them, they kept something of themselves alive. It was not enough, but it was what they had.